listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the Podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood. Today, I am joined by Jennifer Hahn. She is the CMO at Ausha. Jennifer, welcome to the program.
Hello, Heather. Thank you for having me on the show. Really happy to be here.
For sure. So let's start by having you tell us a little bit about Ausha and exactly what you guys do.
Yeah, of course. So Ausha is a platform built for companies and creators who want to grow an audience through podcasting and not just launch a show. So we started as a hosting platform, helping you distribute your podcast on all listening apps, of course, including the biggest ones like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. We also cover YouTube with a two-way approach from podcast to YouTube automatically, but also from YouTube back to podcast apps. And on top of that, and here is our biggest differentiation point, is that we bring marketing tools designed specifically for podcasting. One of them is the podcast search optimization, one of the fastest growing trend right now in the US that help you improve your discoverability on Apple and Spotify. But we also have AI tools for to streamline your episode publishing and a full set of tools to grow your audience, both organically and through paid channels. And for the past 7 years now, the focus has stayed the same, meaning helping podcasts get discovered and scale their audience. And today, we support over 24,000 shows worldwide, from media company, networks, brands to indie creators.
Excellent. So it sounds like you really started as a hosting company, but you felt like there was a need for more, and that's where the optimization tools came in?
Yeah, because, when you distribute your podcast on podcast apps, your show arrived among 5 million shows, and even every new episode you're publishing is, published among more than 2 million new episodes every month, So just being distributed is not enough because, your content stay invisible if you don't do anything, to provide more visibility into these apps. So that was, at the starting point of how we started to think about, okay, being distributing is not enough. How can we help all the creators to gain visibility into this app? Also, we found out that some studies, like the discovery studies from the podcast hosts, they show that 1 in 2 listeners discover new content to consume directly into podcast apps, which totally makes sense because, this is the listening environment. So this is the closest to the conversion to listening. So it makes sense that the best place to gain into visibility and get the most efficient growth will be directly into the podcast apps. And then by digging into the studies and into the listeners' habits, we also discovered that 70% listeners into the podcast apps like Apple and Spotify, 70% of them discovered this show through the search bar, meaning that, I don't know, they're interested in a topic. So they're typing a keyword about that, or a guest, like a famous guest, or I don't know, like, for example, your last interview with Jonas Woos from Member. So if they want to hear about Jonas, they will type in his name and see what type, what content, will show up. Or, even if people recommend a show to you, and we know that recommendation is a big lever, when you hear about the show, what would be your first reflex to look for it? Well, you will type in the name into the search bar, or some keyword that you will remember of the show in the search bar to find it, And all of these, make this space one of the most important space within these apps to be discovered.
Right. So I'm really curious. I have an iPhone and I've been using Apple since I started listening to podcasts, which was probably about 15 years ago, I would guess, maybe 13, something like that, right? And I know Apple's probably not the best listening environment, but I'm just very used to it and I like it and I'm subscribed to all of my shows there. I've tried other kind of more third-party type apps. And I've also tried Spotify, and I know obviously lots and lots of people like Spotify. I just cannot stand their UI. It feels super cluttered to me,
Really?
and it's just not my favorite at all.
Okay.
Um, I personally really struggle with Apple using keywords. So like you said, if I maybe hear of an author that I really like, or if there's like a specific topic that I'm interested in, and I try and type that in the search bar in Apple, I get horrible results. So what I usually do is I usually go to Spotify because Spotify has much better search result capabilities, at least for me. So like if I'm looking for a specific guest, I'll type it in the search bar and I will, I'll see that, oh, here's the author I was looking for, and here are all of the different podcasts they're on. And then sometimes I go back to Apple and I listen on Apple. Sometimes I listen on Spotify, it depends. But I really have not found the two necessarily to be equal. Is that my own experience, or is that the case? Is Spotify more searchable than Apple is?
That's such a good question and observation. First thing is you are right about the difference between both platforms. Their search algorithm don't work the same way.
Hmm.
They don't give the same importance to the same metadata. And also you need to consider that Spotify is also more based on users like users habits recommendations because you are using it for
Mm.
other type of consumption when Apple Podcasts not. So that's why you
Hmm.
will also have a big difference with that. I'm a bit surprised that you find Apple Podcast search like less good than Spotify,
Hmm.
because they are quite good,
Hmm.
in their way of working the search, especially since they integrated as well all the transcription of
Yes.
all the contents, and that's
Yeah.
really powerful, I must say.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's more hitting on Apple search algorithm than Spotify ones, even though like Spotify ones is good. I'm not
Uh-huh.
saying the I not say that it's bad, but Apple one is known for being quite powerful on that. I'm quite intrigued. Like, do you have an example of where you
Well,
you didn't
I
find?
mean, now that you say all of that, I've been doing that for so long that I don't really search on Apple for much. I just automatically go to Spotify. I mean, and as a podcast listener, and this is what I want to talk more about today is just discoverability in general, right? Because I have been listening to podcasts for so long, and so I have the shows that I always listen to. My husband the other day, he goes, "You still listen to Tony Robbins?" I'm like, "Yeah, I still listen to Tony Robbins." But, I mean, I've been listening to the same set, like let's say maybe of 10, 15 podcasts for a really long time. So it's not something that I necessarily am going in and actively searching frequently. And it's very possible that I just have not thought of Apple as being a good resource
Mm,
for searchability, and so I'm not using it. And I
okay.
think that what you mentioned about the transcriptions is really interesting
Mm,
because, in my opinion, that's one of the downsides of the apps just in general, right? I mean, I guess the two, and just to establish, right, we have Spotify, Apple, and YouTube, right? Like those are really
yeah,
the big three
yeah,
listening platforms. And I have struggled with the searchability on Apple and Spotify, right? Like both of them aren't nearly as good as YouTube, which I mean,
of
YouTube is
course.
just so
They
robust
are backed
and
by Google, and YouTube is the second
right,
largest search engine in the world. It's
right.
very powerful about that. Yeah.
Right, right. And so, but I guess I'm really interested to talk about this a bit more. Why has discoverability just, I guess, traditionally been a challenge for podcast listeners?
For podcast listeners, well, I would say about first thing is like you have so many content out there.
Mm-hmm.
So and you know the one that can match your interest and so on. It's quite tricky. I think it's also
Mm-hmm.
that's why people are relying so much on recommendation. You know, also I would say more from the creator's perspective. We haven't made that much efforts in
Sure.
the discoverability because when I came from another industry before, I came from the beauty industry. I was working in L'Oreal,
Oh,
and totally different
yeah.
universe. And what struck me when I arrived in that industry is like people didn't really, like marketing didn't matter to them, and they really didn't understand, what marketing meant,
Uh,
most of them were like doing two things. Like they were focusing on the production of the content, which is like a must have,
mhm.
but as I mentioned, even the best content in the world, if you don't do anything to amplify it, to distribute it, to make listeners discover your content, then it's stay invisible, and in any case no one sees it, and then no one listens to
Mhm.
it. The second thing is more about the people were like creators, and especially B2B players were mostly using like ads campaign to promote the podcast. And well, it's good though, but the only thing is you are budget dependent. As soon as you don't fuel with budget anymore, then your growth stalls.
Right.
And in the latest years, like all budget gets tied up,
Mhm.
and it's harder for most companies and creators to continue to use the ads. But there were like no sustainable organic strategy,
Mhm.
to grow the audience,
Mhm.
in the long run. And this is the approach that we try to bring into the industry, because coming from the, let's say, traditional marketing,
Mhm.
when you are working on a marketing strategy for a brand, you work on both sides, meaning
Sure.
you set up a strong organic strategy based both on with inbound tactics, outbound tactics, and then you fuel, with ad campaigns to accelerate sometimes when you have the budgets,
Mhm.
but it's an accelerator, it's boosters, it's not fundamentals.
Mhm.
And this is something that yeah, it's quite new to our industry in the podcasting, and that we try to bring in.
Mhm. Mhm. So, what exactly is podcast search optimization? Like, because as you mentioned, and I get very confused, frankly, that more people don't talk about it. It seems like your company is one of the only ones out there talking about it. Um, and so, yeah, I guess break down the process of what optimization
Mhm.
is for podcasts.
Yeah. So concretely, if I make it very simple,
Hmm.
um, you have like, if I bring it out to three main steps, in the methodology. The first thing is to identify the right keyword, because as I mentioned, the keywords are fundamental when you're talking about search engine. And the right keywords mean the one first relevant to your
Hmm.
topic,
Hmm.
and the one actually searched by listeners, and the most of them. So you need to find out, okay, which are the keywords interesting for your show. So in your case, podcast advertising, podcast ads, and so on. And but you have many different ways. Even the word advertising, you have so many ways of writing it down. Like even sometimes with a Z, with just saying ads in plural, in singular, and so on. But you want also to understand then which one to choose, which formulation
Hmm.
to choose, and in that case, you need to understand which one has the highest search volume in order for you to get the most important reach, and every keywords, because you're not only like focusing on one keyword, you will get a bunch of keywords, and you can think about like hundreds and thousands of keywords, because the more keywords you add, the more reach you will get,
Sure.
because every keywords is a window open to potential new listeners
Hmm.
for you. So that's the first thing, identifying the right keywords. Then, even though you are ranked, you appear when they search for one keyword, well, you might be like, I don't know, the 160th. but nobody will scroll,
Sure.
endlessly until the end of the search
Yeah.
results. So your target is to reach what I like to call the click to listen zone, which
Mm.
are the top 10, first
Hmm.
results.
Hmm.
And so you need to climb up all the ranks to be in that on that zone in order to get more clicks and get more conversion.
Sure.
But of course, you're not alone trying to get there. So you need to keep an eye on all your competitors.
Hmm.
But it's not your business competitors. It's really about your competitors in each keywords you are tackling.
Mm.
So you need to keep an eye on them. You need to do better than them in order to,
Sure.
outrank them.
Uh-huh.
And because, being in a search result, it's kind of a race because, even though you climb up, you need to also maintain your position
Hmm.
and defend them. Then you need to continuously optimize, your metadata. And we also have like tools that help you to keep optimize them, like very easily and so on.
Sure. Very, very interesting. So what do you think is one of the biggest challenges that podcasters face in discoverability? And do you feel like, I know we talked about transcriptions. Do you feel like discoverability has changed, let's say in the next or in the last 6 to 12 months?
Well, PSO is a new thing.
Mhm.
So it changed in that matter because we get like a real curiosity out of it. Like a lot of people come to us asking what is it, and when we explain what's the strategy of it, it seems so obvious. Most of the
Mhm.
time
Yeah.
the answer, the first answer we get is like, that doesn't exist, already. Like, yeah, no, we're the first one to create it. And so that's one new thing into the discussions about discoverability. And also, I must say, like, I didn't see things changing that much because I think we are still lacking of, more in-depth data about how our listeners are really discovering, podcasts, new
Yeah.
podcasts to consume. We have like great studies from Sounds Profitable with Tom or Edison Research, but with very like micro data about how they discover, and your podcast in most of the time is like very like YouTube, podcast apps,
Mhm.
social media, and so on. But for example, if you take like the social media, I would love to know more, in depth about that. Like in the social media, is it through the feeds? Is it because their friends DM them something? Is it through the content of the podcast hosts himself? How do they exactly discover, the podcast? Or even when they are, about the cross promotion, or when another podcaster talk about another show,
Mhm.
and promote another show. Well, those listeners really stop their listening to switch the show and listen to the new one when they attend to listen to this one? I'm not completely sure,
Mhm.
although after, the end of listening, like, I don't know, an hour episode, they will still remember the name of the show the host dropped at the beginning of the episode. I'm wondering, and I would
Mhm.
love to know more about
Mhm.
that. And I really think that we will advance more in tackling discoverability, podcast discoverability, if we also, dig more into the studies.
Yeah, into listener behavior. Well, and I think that's all super fascinating, right? So I do think I always, of course, look at my own behavior, and what I tend to do is, to your point, very rarely will I stop listening to a podcast to go and listen to a different podcast. What I might do if I hear of a show that does sound interesting is I might pause the show I'm listening to and
Mhm.
go and find the show that sounds interesting, and then I usually just hit follow.
Okay.
And then so then next time I open my app to decide what to listen to, I'm like, oh yeah, there was this show I wanted to listen to, right? And so then I'll check that out. So that's my listening behavior. The other
Okay.
thing that I
Interesting.
do is I will listen to a podcast and then I mean, I would probably like 50-50. I love interview-based podcasts. I know that there's always lots of talks about like, are there too many interview-based podcasts? But I love them. And if I'm listening to, let's say at the end of the show, we find out, Jennifer, that you have a podcast. And maybe as a listener, people are like, oh, I really enjoyed Jennifer's interview. Then they would go over and listen to your show. And I have a tendency of doing that. If I'm like, oh man, I really enjoy this guest. I like the things that they're saying, then I'll go and try and find their show. And I subscribe that way. And I know that I can't remember if it sounds profitable or if it's Edison Research or maybe the both of them, but I do think it's also super important when we're thinking about listener behavior to identify, I can't remember what they call them precisely, but like the super listener, like the super fan, and then like the casual listener, because I certainly would put myself into like that super listener category. And when we think about discoverability, I feel like we have to look at it in tiers, right? We can't just say everyone is created equal. And if you're someone who has never listened to a podcast, and I think that's the piece that's most confusing to me is if you've never listened to a podcast, what makes you like, what's that tipping point? What makes you say, today's the day that I want to listen to a show? Is it that you saw a social media post or an ad for a show? Is it that maybe you were consuming some other kind of content and that person recommended a podcast and you're like, okay, I guess that's it? Or is it just generally that people talk about podcasts and all of a sudden one day you're like, everybody's been talking about podcasts. Maybe I should just go check them out, But I guess what are your thoughts about like that range of listener?
Yeah, totally true. I'm fully aligned with you. You're right. We need more granular data and this segmentation. And it's indeed the study of Tom Webster from Sounds Profitable. You're right. There's a big distinction between how the listeners being converted to the format of the podcast and got seduced by the podcast as a media.
Right.
For the first time, and then making the listenership increasing, and how let's say more like people who maybe the listeners who are more used to consume podcasts, how they discover new contents. And you're right, it's such a big difference, and it might not be the same habit at all.
Right, right. Well, and I always tell people who are trying to grow an audience that podcast listeners listen to podcasts, right? Because, we look at things from an advertising perspective, right? So I also think like it's much easier to convince someone who's running social media ads that they should run podcast ads instead of going to a company that's like, I don't advertise at all, and then trying to convince them to buy a podcast ad, right? And so it's harder to convince someone who doesn't listen to podcasts that your show is one they should listen to, as opposed to if you're like, oh yeah, I listen to 2 hours of shows a day. Well, you're going to be an easier conversion, right, for a new listener. But if you wanted to go deeper, there's also only so many hours in the day, right? And I think the average, I think the super listener is up to 8 episodes that they listen to in a week. But so
different shows.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It just depends on who it is you're targeting. So, I guess thinking about listener behavior, do you have any recommendations? Obviously, we're talking about optimization, but what are your thoughts in terms of best practices for growing an audience?
Oh my God, I can talk about that for hours. That's such a question, right? Well, first thing, if we stay with your segmentation that I really like and think that's pretty interesting. If we think about converting people to the podcast medium, I think even though we know that the biggest show, the top shows are making the most of that work,
Sure.
Making people discovering just the format of the podcast because they are celebrities and their awareness is really spread into the mass market, let's say that way. But I would say YouTube is a great way, to make people coming for the content first, or for the host first, through YouTube because it's more accessible, more, it's well known and so on and more used.
Mm-hmm.
And then, through YouTube, talking about your podcast and then making people come to your show, your audio only format then. And it shows that I think it's like Edison Research study show that 86% of listeners mix the conception of
Yeah.
podcast on like both video and audio only podcast. So I think it's a good, a good bridge, to bring people into the podcast world. And when it comes to like the hardcore listeners, I would say, first of all, as I mentioned, of course, within the podcast apps with PSO, it's a big thing. You can also, try other way to increase your visibility into these podcast apps, like launching ad campaign, but through Spotify ads or YouTube ads. You have like great display ads that are showing up as well during when you're listening to another podcast and so on. I think also a great way, and we are launching a solution for that in the coming weeks. So
nice.
you got the premiere of that announcement, and also when we were talking about YouTube, even for these hardcore listeners, because they are also consuming YouTube, and distributing, not only like launching ads campaign into YouTube, but also just distributing your content, your audio only podcast directly into YouTube can be a great way, to extend your reach and make them discover, your content, because a lot of them might not know that your podcast does exist, and discover it in another way, and seeing that it's an audio only content on YouTube, can make them convert to yours.
Yeah. No, that's really fascinating. You made a comment that I hadn't really considered, but I think it could be a really strong entry point for new listeners, which is that there are those celebrity podcasts. And, obviously Joe Rogan, the Joe Rogan Experience has been one of the largest podcasts out there. And when he had Trump on, I think that there were probably a lot of people who had not listened to podcasts who were like, oh, well, I want to go and check this out. Or, you could copy and paste that to lots of those big shows, right? That one particular conversation can be an entry point, and then they're like, oh, well, that was interesting. I liked that. Now I'm going to go check something else out. And so you partnered with Edison Research to analyze the top 50 podcasts. And I guess tell us a little bit about that study and what exactly did you look at?
Well, to provide more elements of the context, Edison Research is well known for publishing the top 50 US podcasts every quarter. And they are quite, their top chart is quite known, within the industry. And of course, we were following it since many years. Also because we know the team very well since many years, and we really love to collaborate with them. They are maybe the nicest people I ever met.
Yes, they are.
So, and to be honest, it's this idea of this study started first on our side because we launched a new feature into our PSO tool, which is called like category benchmark. So in a nutshell, for every top charts of Apple and Spotify, every category and subcategory of these two apps, we provide, some, let's say, data about their podcasting practices of these top shows. So, for example, we give like the average of number of characters into the title and description of episode, number of reviews they have on the show, even like the publishing days, the length of the average length of each episode, and so on. And because we were doing that for Apple and Spotify, we realized that we can also, extract the data for any type of charts. And then we had the idea with Gabriel Soto, the director of research of Edison Research, to extract that data of this top 50 in order to provide more insight to all creators to also better understand what these top shows were doing. And I'm not saying like if they're doing right or wrong, and that's
Sure.
not our role, but just, give a sense of, okay, did
Yeah.
you know that, for example, they are mostly publishing on Mondays? And Edison Research added their analysis because this was correlated to their own studies of listeners' habits, showing that like most of the consumption were during weekdays. So it totally makes sense, that these
Sure.
top shows publish also at the beginning of the weekday.
Hmm.
And for example, we also learned that the average of number of characters into the title of the show, of this top show, is twice longer than the average of the show's title in Apple Podcast shows. Meaning that, okay, these top shows enrich more than metadata than the others,
Interesting. Is it
Yeah.
the name of the show or the
Yeah,
name
the
of the
name of the show.
episode? The actual
The name
name
of the
of the
show, but
show.
the name of the episode as well. But the name of the show is quite, was higher than the other. Yeah.
Interesting. Huh. I would think that something succinct and easy would be a better option. But that's the cool thing about doing research, right? Is that you see like, well, what are these people doing and how can you emulate it to try and
Yeah.
mirror their success?
Yeah. Try to either, duplicate what they're doing or, take the opposite way in order to
Mhm.
differentiate. I'm always like advising to all our clients to, test and learn.
Right.
These are data. It doesn't mean that you have to do exactly like them, but it gives you like, at least
Mhm.
some keys and ideas to explore and try on your show.
Mhm.
When we publish this study, like I had a lot of clients calling me like saying like 14 average of 14 episodes per month they are publishing, like it's impossible to keep that pace of production. They were like reassuring them like, if you dig into each top show and you just look at the feed of the show, you will realize that in fact, even though they're publishing like every 2 days, something like that, it's not the long form of the episode.
Right.
They are mixing it with some teaser, some
Yes.
like previous episode, etc., etc. But it's a good trick because all the search algorithm are pretty pleased by that. Your show seems to keep the freshness of the content.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's an interesting practice to try.
Yeah, yeah, that's really fascinating. So this study, is it available to anyone
Yeah,
to see the study? Great. And
yeah,
what
yeah,
is
yeah.
the
You can
exact
find it
name
on.
of it?
The name of the study was
Mhm.
the anatomy of the success of the top 50 US podcasts.
Okay,
Yeah, you can
great.
find it online and you can find it on our blog, on our
Uh-huh.
website, ausha.co.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm super interested. I try to look at as many studies as I can, but I do tend to focus a lot on monetization and on advertising. So that study did not catch my attention, and I'm really interested now to go back and take a look and to share it with our podcasters, right?
Yeah.
Because being able to learn from those, I think, are really, yeah, that's really interesting.
Instead of the study either, you should directly try our feature, online. I can give you some access if you want after the interview, but then you can go and check directly into your category. I don't know which category you syndicated to,
I think
like
I'm in
in marketing.
marketing.
Yeah, in
Yeah.
marketing. I think the most interesting for you is to check within the marketing category into
Uh-huh.
Apple, Spotify, and check where your show stands, versus the average of that category top shows. And that's exactly the purpose of this feature, So you will be able to bring your RSS feed without importing anything, but you will see exactly your data versus the best one of your category. And,
Hmm.
it will be more relevant on comparing to something as broad as the top 50 US podcast.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. So
that'll be more,
interesting.
more relevant for you.
Yeah. And so you have a standalone tool. So you don't have to host your podcast at Ausha, right, in order to
Yeah.
take advantage of your search tools.
Yeah, not at all. Yeah,
Okay,
you
okay.
can stay at with your hosting platform and still use our tool. Our goal is really to be an additional a brick to your marketing stack. You mentioned just earlier that you were focusing on monetization mostly, and you're right to do so. Monetization is important. Getting revenue is important, but if you get more audience, then at the end of the day, you will also get more revenues, right?
Absolutely.
And so we want to bring more solutions to help you grow your audience, keep your monetization solution, keep, all the way you are doing today to monetize your content, keep your hosting platform, but just add us in the middle in order to grow your audience faster.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think that looking at it from an advertising lens, that one of the things we find is that a podcast can have a great audience, but if the audience isn't growing, advertiser results tend to wane because essentially you might have an advertiser might have a really strong result out the gate because they're hitting all of these new people who maybe haven't heard about their product, or they're able to make conversions. But then once they can kind of saturate that audience, if the podcast is growing, then there are new listeners that are coming in there and they're getting exposed to the products, and then you're going to continue to create good results for that advertiser. But if you've got, if you've got a show that's really stagnant, then the advertiser isn't going to see good results ultimately, because at some point they're going to have, they're going to reach saturation. And so audience growth is really important. And I know we need to start wrapping it up, but I wanted to chat a little bit. I know you mentioned a new release that you guys are doing, and I'm curious, does it have anything to do with what you're building that I hear is kind of comparable to what Chartable was? Chartable is a tool that everybody loved, and Spotify bought it and closed it, which was a little disappointing. But yeah, tell us what you guys are working on.
Yeah, so first of all, we also loved Chartable, and it broke our hearts to see it, closing, because it was one of the let's say, like, historic platform, within the industry. In fact, we are not only building it; we launched it since several months.
Cool.
We created Ausha Charts, which is doing like more or less than what Chartable was doing on the freemium part, and we also provided for free and for free forever. Like, there's like really no need to pay anything. It will help you, of course, what Chartable was doing. So to track all the top charts, get notified, if your position is changing and whatever, so on. So we are doing the same. You can also check the evolution of the position of other shows, your competitors, if you're interested into. We are already providing that. You can go on our website and just create an account, and you will access to all of that for free.
Okay, excellent. That's terrific. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for being on the show today. It's been such an interesting conversation. I love talking about advertising, but I think that talking about audience growth is really very fascinating. And just that piece of finding new shows is so important to the evolution of the industry. So thank you for being here. And if people want to connect, what is a good way for them to find you and the products that Ausha provides?
Yeah, and thank you so much, Heather. I was so happy to be part of this conversation. If you guys want to, you can contact me on LinkedIn. You can find me like easily at my profile, Jennifer Han, or you can send an email to the team at hello@osha.co.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you for listening. I hope that you have enjoyed this episode. It really is fascinating. And I hope that you are, as a podcaster, using some of these tools, but also as a listener, I hope that you are trying to discover new podcasts, because there are so many great ones out there. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again next time. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.